It gives me great pleasure to introduce you today to Lynnae Ruttledge. Lynnae and I met a couple of years ago in Brussels at a research meeting, and I think we just clicked.
Definitely.
we just got really good friends, and whenever Lynnae said that she'd never been to Northern Ireland and she wanted to see Northern Ireland, I just couldn't not invite her to give us a talk here. That's right. Sorry about that. No, so she's actually on her holidays, so we're very privileged to have her actually giving us a workshop today while she's on holidays. And I have to read this because I can't remember all the accolades. Lynnae has committed her career to disability-related public policy and program development with a focus on employment of adults with disabilities. In her work in the fields of education, independent living, vocational rehabilitation and international exchange, Lynnae has provided effective leadership for collaborative partnerships with educators, researchers, advocates, business community-based organizations and governmental agencies. And I think we've seen some of that excellent networking skills a minute ago when Lynnae was making the rounds already. Lynnae currently serves as presidential appointee to the National Council on Disability, an independent federal agency that advises President Obama, Congress and other federal agencies on disability policy. In addition, she serves as a disability policy advisor to the DOCTRID Institute. The DOCTRID Institute is an all-Ireland institute with collaborators in various American universities. And we were just talking to them, and that's how we met, through the DOCTRID Institute. In 2013, Lynnae also served as a presidential appointee to the 15-member US Senate Commission on Long-Term Care. Lynnae provided national leadership to the Public Vocational Rehabilitation Program as Commissioner of the Rehabilitation Services Administration with the US Department of Education from 2010 to 2012. Throughout her extensive public service career, Lynnae has held public policy development and executive level leadership positions at the local, state and national levels. Committed to international disability rights advocacy, Lynnae is a strong supporter of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. She has been affiliated with Mobility International USA, a US-based disability rights NGO since 1988, and has served as a citizen diplomat in educational exchanges in South America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Australia, New Zealand, Russia and Europe. Lynnae and her husband, an Irish citizen by the way, makes her home in the state of Washington in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm just delighted that Lynnae is now going to add to her list of visits, places she visited, that she's been in Belfast and at Queen's. Lynnae, right. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's always interesting to hear people talk about me because I have had a really long and very enriching career in public service. But when I listen to all that, I keep saying to myself, I can't be that old. It's not possible that I've done all of those things in my life. But it is, and I've recently retired, and it gives me the opportunity to be able to come and visit with colleagues like Professor Dillenberger and be able to spend time in environments like this where I can talk with people about things that, for me, are critical issues in the 21st century. So I'm going to spend some time talking with you about policy issues, about strategies, about research, about effective practices. And I'm not sure if you're used to having an exchange with the person who's lecturing you, but you're going to get used to it because I'm going to go through a part of my talk and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask you some questions because for me, it's as much I want to learn from you as you having a chance to hear from me. This is, as Carola said, my first chance to come to Northern Ireland, and I've had a marvelous time for this past week. My husband is not quite used to driving on the left side of the road, so it's been very scary some of the time. But you know, you get to a place where we've been married for 40 years and I've trusted him this long. I have to trust him to get me through this week safely. And so far we've done it, so, but that's a good thing. This was really just an amazing invitation. When I have told colleagues and partners and friends that I've had an opportunity and an invitation to come to the Queen's University Belfast, people have been very complimentary that this is indeed an honor. And so to Carola, who's also my friend, thank you. This is an honor for me to do this. And as you saw as I walked around, I am not shy. I tend to want to know who's in the room and what brought you here. And it's been helpful to hear of people's long careers in policy development, people that have been to the United States, people that do occupational therapy, people that do supported employment, people who engage with people through sport. Those are all real valued ways to be able to identify and help people reach their vocational goals. So I'm hopeful in the time we have together, and we'll probably have like an hour and 15 minutes, and then we get to have coffee, which again is always just a delightful way for me to get to know people a little bit better. And I'm just hoping this will be an exchange over this next hour or so. As Carola was sharing with you my background, I thought it might be helpful if I would start not by telling you all those things that I've done, but to start with what I consider to be my most important attribute, and that's that I'm a person with a disability. I was born with a disability, so I've had my disability all of my life. And as such, I've benefited from services and programs. I've had discriminatory acts happen in relationship to my career and to my education, but I've also had the chance to meet with President Obama. And for me, that is one of those opportunities where you have to think about, how else was I going to ever have a chance to meet with the President of the United States? It wasn't because I was a young girl growing up in the Midwest. It wasn't because I initially became a teacher. It was because I'm a person with a disability and I'm passionate about disability rights. So for me, to characterize disability as an attribute to which I am very proud, I hope that's one of the things that you take away from our presentation today. We're going to talk about some disability-related employment policies. And I'm not going to pretend that I know about the policies that you have here in Northern Ireland. I've done some reading and some research, but I'm going to talk mostly from the perspective of what I've seen in the United States. And that's not to say that I think what we have done in the United States is the best. In fact, there are places where I think almost anyone could do it better than what we have. But we have a long history of respecting individual rights and having a rights-based approach. And I think that's one of the most important things from my perspective about why it's important to even talk about disability-related employment policy. It's not just employment policy, but it's how we look at disability in relationship to our human resources policies, our academic policies, the policies that govern the way people live their lives, and what happens when you have a disability that's impacting all of that. So I'm going to start with some examples of employment policy. I'm going to talk with you about some strategies that I've seen that have been effective in increasing employment of people with disabilities. I'm going to talk a little bit about some research initiatives and places where I think as we move forward, we need to really focus. And I'm going to talk about effective practices, because I think it's by learning from what works is what's going to move our whole field forward. And then at the end, I'm going to really challenge you to envision what would you recommend to assure better employment outcomes for people with disabilities. and especially in the role that you play, whether you're an OT or you're in supported employment or you're a parent, it makes really no difference. I'll be interested in knowing what you envision are the policy changes that need to be in place in order to make the future better for people with disabilities. My focus is going to be primarily on competitive employment, on employment for adults with disabilities. I know that you get a lot of training and access to information about supported employment, and I'm going to add some examples that we've learned from, because evidence-based practices are really a part of what supported employment is, and we need to know more about that. But I'm going to talk more about adults, and especially adults who acquire their disabilities later on in life, and how to be able to make sure that they can continue to be productive and contribute to the workplace. My perspective comes on a very personal level. I'm a person with a disability. My sister has learning disabilities. My husband has an acquired hearing disability that he acquired just before he was planning to retire. And so for me, it's very personal. But at the same time, I've had this very rich cough that's driving me crazy. Excuse me. I've had this very rich career that's focused on employment policy. So let's just get started. We use disability employment policy to really impact our thinking about people with disabilities, to impact and shape our expectations, and to impact and shape our obligations. So when you start to think about the relationship you have with a person with a disability, how you perceive them, what you think of in terms of your expectations, and then what your obligations are all places that are impacted with public policy around people with disabilities, and especially around employment. In the United States, our first examples came after World War I. That's how vocational rehabilitation got started. We were concerned about people coming back from having been in the war and having them be made whole again. So there was a strong focus on individuals having mobility, individuals having prosthetic devices, but not as much as what we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years of the impact psychologically to people who have been involved in any of the war efforts. We also know from Afghanistan and from Iran that there are so many in Iraq, that there are so many people that come back from the Middle East and have had blast injuries, which is very similar to what happened to my husband. And with that comes a whole array of complications in terms of employment. So when you start to think about the impact that you've had as a result of serving your country, one of the things that I always think about is how ready is the employer to bring that person back to work? How ready is that person and their family to making sure that that person has all of the tools and resources they need to be able to go back to work? In 1990, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which became the landmark legislation, not just in our country, but around the globe, for civil rights for people with disabilities. And what's interesting in terms of the United States is that started from a foundation in 1964, where we as a rights-based country had said people have basic civil rights based on sex, gender, race, religion, but they didn't include disability. And so much of that has to do with the perceptions of people with disabilities in the mid-1960s was very different than the perceptions of people with disabilities by the 1990s. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, which has very specific provisions around employment, became our basis for how we viewed our expectations around employment for people with disabilities and what we expected in terms of state and government services, as well as our expectations in the private sector. It's important to recognize that the ADA is a non-discrimination law. So the basic policy basis of the ADA is really around non-discrimination. When you look at more recently in the United States, it's been more of a focus on things like employment first, which is a policy related to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's not included in the law. It is at a state level that states are saying that we have higher expectations around, excuse me, I've had this awful cough. I'm going to get a cough drop so that you don't have to listen to me cough for the rest of this time. So employment first is a really great example of a policy that was developed, and especially for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and really focused on what should our expectations be for especially youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities as they leave high school. And what should the expectation be for them in the future? And in the past, especially in the United States, the expectation was that people would end up in sheltered workshops, in environments where they didn't have integrated competitive employment, and frankly, the expectations were very low. Part of the movement behind Employment First has been from people with developmental and intellectual disabilities who said, we have a different future in mind. And when we leave high school, we want to become employed. And we want to go to college. We want to be involved in the community. We want the same kinds of things that we see that our brothers and sisters have. And we want to make sure that the community views us as making a contribution. And so the whole philosophy of Employment First was a policy shift from segregated employment or settings to competitive integrated employment. And it has as much to do with the expectations for that individual as it does for the families and what their expectations are for their family members. At the national level, I've been honored to be a part of President Obama's team to be able to look at how do you increase employment of people with disabilities. And from his perspective, it came in several different packages. One package had to do with if you have a federal contractor, and much of the work that we do in the United States isn't done by federal employees any longer, it's done by contractors. And so we contract out a lot of work. And we wanted to use that hook to be able to say, how could federal contractors be held responsible for employing people with disabilities? And so a part of what the President's executive order earlier this year said, if you're a federal contractor, you need to pay at least minimum wage to your employees. And that includes people with disabilities. Now that's important because in the United States since 1938, we've had a federal minimum wage law that gave a provision so that people with significant disabilities could be paid less than minimum wage. And as a disability rights advocate, I see employment and making real wages a civil rights issue. And so I was really happy that the President put that forward as a part of his policy to say that federal contractors needed to pay everyone at least minimum wage, and that included people with disabilities that worked for those federal contractors. Another package that the President put forward was that federal contractors had to have 7% of their employees be people with disabilities across all job categories. So it wasn't just that you could meet that minimum criteria by hiring people at the lowest levels in your organization. It was really an expectation and a public policy that people with disabilities should be employed across the spectrum of jobs, and that those would be opportunities for people with disabilities to not only make good wages, but be a part of the middle class. There's been efforts by governors in various states, led by one particular governor when he was president of the Governors Association, to have an employment policy for people with disabilities that said that state government should be a model employer. And with that would come the same kinds of provisions that you have in your Disability Discrimination Act around reasonable adjustments. Well, we have the same expectations in the US around employment and what we call reasonable accommodations. And so we thought at a state level, state government is, in some states, a major employer, and they have the opportunity to provide good wages, good benefits, good working conditions for people with disabilities. And so that initiative, that blueprint, became a way for governors to make sure that they were using their power of public policy to increase employment of people with disabilities at the state level. Some of us were talking as I got started, and there are some inherent tensions in policy between a benefits-based system and an employment-based system. So if you have people that rely upon benefits and have to make choices between employment and benefits, at times that's a choice between poverty and having a career. And one of the things that's been important for us in terms of public policy in the United States is to find ways to get employment opportunities for people, especially young adults and adults, to be on career paths where they can be a part of the middle class, rather than having to rely on benefits and most likely be at a poverty level. We know that for individuals with mobility limitations, individuals that use sign language interpreters, individuals who are blind, making sure that they have access to technology and access to assistive technology and universal design, those are all employment-related policies that make a huge difference for people with disabilities. We've been pretty excited in the United States about the progress that the private sector has made in really making employment of people with disabilities a priority. And part of that is the same motivation that we see with any other leader. It's usually based on a family member. It's usually based on a personal experience. But we've found employers in the private sector to actually be more forward-thinking than employers in the public sector. And they have used their ability to have a business case, so they can actually say, an investment in a person with a disability is better for my bottom line. And for me, that's one of the most appropriate kinds of disability employment policy statements that we can make, is that we start to see what's that return on investment? What's the expectations of that employer that when they hire people with disabilities, they don't do it for a social reason, they don't do it for charity, they do it because they believe that that person contributes. Having worked my entire career with people with significant disabilities, I can tell you that by and large, they are the most creative problem solvers I've ever known, because they have to problem solve from the time they wake up until the time they go to bed. My husband has acute hearing loss because of a blast injury, and his reliance on technology is incredible. and his level of frustration because of the vagaries of technology is really high at times. But I'll tell you that he knows more than his audiologist does about the technology he uses, because he goes to the internet, he looks up devices, he goes onto blog sites to find out what works, what doesn't work with the hearing aids he's considering. And so he's a very well-informed consumer by the time he goes to see his audiologist. I would ask you to think about what's the advantage of having people with disabilities in the workforce who understand that when they are accommodated, they're going to bring very unique skills and talents to that workplace. And I think that's one of those human resources issues and disability-related employment issues that we don't often talk about, is what are the assets that that person brings to the workplace? It's usually more the deficit model of how much time are they going to be off, what kind of issues do we have with health care, do we think that they're going to be able to get to work on time? Those are all the same issues that we have with every other employee. So I would ask you to think differently about what people with disabilities bring to the workplace and how that then translates into human resources kinds of, both their human resource policies, but also their employment-related policies for people with disabilities. So again, I think we use public policy to shape our thinking, to shape our perceptions, and to shape our expectations about people with disabilities. And at the same time, it helps shape our obligations. What is it that we need to do differently and better so that people with disabilities get better employment outcomes? So this is where we pause for a minute, and I'm going to ask you to think about and share back with me, what do you see as some of the most relevant disability employment policy issues currently in Northern Ireland? If you were to try to capture in just a couple sentences what you think are the important disability-related employment issues, what are those? And trust me, I will come around and I will ask you if you don't raise your hand. So, and you all don't probably know Carola as well as I have the fortune of knowing her, but one day I got an email from her, and at the bottom of her email in Latin, she had a statement. And so, of course, because of Google, you can go and find out what it says, and I realized that she's the only person I ever knew that had nothing about us without us in Latin. So, you know, there are just those things that we need to keep at the forefront of our minds, and nothing about us without us really is one of those basic tenets that we need in our policies, in our strategies, in our practices. And people may be very well-meaning, but they don't know the personal experience that we have. And we need to be in a position where we're valued for providing that input. So, but those are good points. Thank you. We're going to move on, but thank you for participating. You guys were beyond my expectations. I really appreciate that. You know, it's hard when you come to another culture and you don't really know, are people used to participating? And if you open-end questions to people, will they respond? And you did very well, so thank you. So let's move into strategies. And I've been sharing some of these, and this isn't an organized list. This is more random thoughts about things that may be going on in Northern Ireland, maybe things that you've read about, but they're things that I've seen to be successful strategies around disability employment policy that really make a difference. One of them is the concept of having technical assistance centers. So having organizations or bodies, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a part of government, it really makes no difference, but an entity that provides technical assistance so that you have a chance to be able to explore ideas and options and suggestions. I was the director of a technical assistance center related to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I was working with people with disabilities who are covered under the ADA. I was working with state and local government who are entities that have responsibilities. I was working with businesses who had responsibilities. And it provided that forum for being able to talk about disability employment policy from whatever perspective the person came from. So for a person with a disability, they want to know what their rights are. They want to know what their options are. They want to know what the resources are. Well, employers, businesses, governments all have similar kinds of questions. Sometimes they want to know how to get out of it, and I recognize that. But a lot of times they just want to know how to comply. What are some ways to engage with their employees around those disability employment policies that work? What are some ways to find out what doesn't work? And so using the concept of a technical assistance center is one that I found to be particularly effective around disability employment policy. A practice that I was talking with the group of folks who do supported employment that's started in the United States, and it's called Project Search. And Project Search was actually started at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And it was a way for the hospital to employ people with significant intellectual and developmental disabilities in jobs across the hospital that freed up work for other workers. And the best example is that there's a woman, her name is Erin Riley. She is the person who started Project Search at Children's Hospital, and it's now in 130 different locations around the world. But she was the head of emergency room services. She's an RN. And what she saw was that the students who came in to work in the ER, who were in the supply room, and their job was to put the supplies into the right bins, weren't necessarily very good at it because they didn't have a lot of incentive to do it right. They were just there for a job. And so emergency room personnel need to trust that when they go to grab something out of one of those bins, that they have the right gauze, they have the right syringe, they have whatever piece of equipment they were looking for. And so Children's Hospital had an initiative to increase employment of people with disabilities, and Erin's approach was, what if we created a partnership with community-based organizations around employment of people with disabilities, and we brought people with disabilities into the hospital to learn to do those jobs. And the way that she did that was through an internship program with the local school. And students would come in for a year-long academic program. So they'd come for 3 10-week internships. And throughout that time, they would learn the jobs in the emergency room, they would learn jobs in the cafeteria, they would learn jobs up in the surgical centers, they would learn jobs across the hospital. And then at the end of each day, they would be back in their classroom that was based at the hospital, talking about what they learned that day and what their challenges were and what they wanted to do next. Well, the evidence is that Project Search results in 80% of those kids finishing their internships and becoming employed. That's the highest rate of employment success of any program that I've been affiliated with. So it's finding those practices that lead to employment that can be a part of your disability employment policy. And I would actually challenge academic programs, high school programs, to shift the way they see their academic programs and increase the amount of time that kids spend outside of the classroom and have them be in businesses and having them learn the work skills and having them integrated into the workplace. I think that's where we're going to see substantive change in not only disability employment policy, but also disability employment outcomes. Some of the other strategies that I've seen that work particularly well have been in academic programs. So at a College level, most college students have practicums, they have internships, they have work experiences. Those are all built into their academic program. Whether they're studying to be an engineer or a physical therapist or a human services assistant makes absolutely no difference. They all have those as real common parts of their academic programs. I can tell you, as the head of a voc rehab agency, having a call from a counselor who said to me, Lynnae, can you help me set up an informational interview with my client who has finished their law program and wants to become an attorney? And I said, sure, I'll talk to our Attorney General's office. We have a great relationship with them. I'm sure they'd be willing to do an informational interview with your client. So I call up my contact at the AG's office, and he says to me, so Lynnae, where did your client do his internship? Where did he do his clerkship? Where did he do the work to show that when he becomes an attorney, that he's going to be able to demonstrate the skills he's been learning academically? And I said, you know, Eric, I didn't even think to ask that. And I called back and talked to the counselor, and because I just thought that was just a basic expectation. Called back, talked to the counselor, and the counselor said he didn't do any of those. This is a young man with severe cerebral palsy, great intellect, bright kid, but has very poor communication skills because of his cerebral palsy. And so the school had decided that they would just not require that he do an internship. Well, I think we need to change the way academics think. Here I am at the Queen's University, but sorry about that. But we need to change the way academics think and expect that students with significant disabilities have the same interactions, the same opportunities, but they may just be in a different format. But that was a real clear picture to me that academic programs have to change so that when we start to look at disability employment policy, we're saying from the educator's perspective, the educators learn from the very beginning how to include people with disabilities in their programs, how to have an expectation that the students in their programs are going to become employed, and how to be able to engage with that person with that significant disability about the ways that can work. We can't just decide for a person with a disability what's going to work for them. We have to engage with them to say, we expect that you will do an internship. How do you think that's going to work? Who do you think you would do it with? What kinds of contacts can we make now to make that happen for you? But I think that that's a part of disability employment policy that we think only rests with the employer. Well, I think it rests also with academic preparation programs. I think there needs to be leadership by business in terms of embracing universal design and being at the forefront of sharing their experiences of hiring people with disabilities. We use in the United States a United States Business Leadership Network. So it's a network of business-led organizations across the country. And they're involved every day in sharing their success stories. But they're also telling us about what are the disability employment policies that work and don't work for them. When they are told by an applicant, yes, I really want this job, but I can only work 10 hours a week. Or, yes, I really do want to do this, but my caregiver can't get to my home until 7:30, and I can't get to work until 9:30, but you're requiring that I be here at 8 o'clock. Those are the kinds of things that we need to work with businesses around about how to be flexible in terms of expectations, but also to be able to say, maybe we need to also be talking with those caregivers about how to adjust their hours to better meet the needs of that new employee. And I think those are places where we haven't been as willing to push back on those other systems, and we need to start to figure those out. one of the things in the abstract that I wrote is that we need to make sure that especially young adults and people that are entering the workforce, that they have the skills to compete in the 21st work century. We can't have people not understanding what social media is. We can't have people not understanding that when you post something on Facebook that your mother would be embarrassed by, that trust me, an employer will have looked at it. That's what employers do now. They will mine all of the social media sites about people that are applying for jobs, and they're going to know what you said on your LinkedIn site. They're going to know if you've had very bad grammar. They're going to know if you didn't have anyone do spell check. They're going to know if you said things like born to drink as your Twitter. You know, I mean, it's those kinds of things that young people just do because they don't think. But for a person with a disability, they have to understand the social impact of that. That's a part of understanding and having the skills to compete in the 21st century workplace that are going to make the difference. They have to be able to use technology. They've got to be able to understand how to use an iPad. I can tell you the numbers of people with autism that have transformed how they're able to communicate because of their use of technology. The individuals that I can now communicate with who are deaf or who are visually impaired because of their access to technology. Those are all disability employment policies that we need to think about whether or not a person understands how they're going to be able to access the workplace and if they're going to have those skills to compete. Some of the other things that I've seen really be successful in terms of strategies, and this is one that I started in my career as a vocational counselor. I saw myself as being able to talk with another person with a disability and help them understand their strengths and help to be able to put together a vocational plan. I have to tell you that that's an outmoded way of thinking about how we interact with people with disabilities. We no longer use a medical model. We no longer use a charity model. What people respond to better are life coaches. Someone who could sit down with you and say, so who are you? What do you want to do? What are the skills that you have to be successful? Rather than talk about what are your limitations, what are all the problems and challenges that you've had in seeking employment, but think about you as a person who requires and can benefit from having a life coach. Someone whose job it is to help you identify who are you. My husband was forced to retire before chronologically and psychologically he was ready to do that because of an acoustic trauma injury. And the most successful part of his recovery was finally being able to start to say who he was. Because for a very long time, he saw himself as a human resource professional, as a labor relations professional, as a person who was absolutely in control of his life. And suddenly, he was relying on technology. He cannot have a conversation with you spontaneously. He can't do it because he doesn't know what you're saying. He can hear the words, but there are times where the context just doesn't make any sense to him, and what he hears is not what you said. And so for him, he really had to think about who was he? He was 64. He thought he would retire within a year. He thought he would probably do some consulting as a human resources, labor relations person. And suddenly that wasn't who he was at all. But what he had become is a much better photographer. He became much better at the technology he uses with his photography. And he actually became a volunteer with the Geological Center near our house that monitors Mount St. Helens, because they needed someone to digitally archive hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos. But Ed can do those things. And so I encourage you, when you think about disability employment policy, that we not use the same traditional roles that we've always had, but we think differently about how we engage with people, especially adults, who incur age-related or injury-related disabilities later on in life. A friend of mine is a person who worked in a credit union. So she worked in a bank, and she was slowly losing her hearing. And she was coached to no longer be employed. Rather than to think about how they might accommodate her, it was easier to say, oh, Karen, you should stop working. The same is true for many people with age-related disabilities, whether it's related to arthritis or recovery from cancer or a lack of vision or a loss of hearing. It really makes no difference. We need all the talent we can get in the workplace. And for many young people, having access to people who have greater time in place, who can share their stories, is far more productive than all the training that we can send people to. So I encourage us to think about disability employment policies that really change that dynamic and start to think about things like life coaches and being able to answer the question, who am I? Well, thank you very much, everyone. This has been a great conversation. Yay! Thank you.